Hello, everybody. I'm Bincheng Mao, president of East Coast Coalition for Tolerance and Non-Discrimination. I'm so honored to be here today to speak with Mr. Peter MacKay about the rule of law, minority inclusion, and youth engagement in public service. Mr. MacKay, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Bincheng. I'm pleased to be with you. Look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Let me start with the international response to Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Over the past few days, we've seen the sheer courage displayed by the Ukrainian people on the ground, but they do need a lot of support from the outside world. What role do you think the international community in Canada should play in response to the invasion from both a legal and a defense point of view?
Well, firstly, it is very tragic, and the human suffering and the humanitarian crisis that is emerging there with displaced people, but innocent citizens who are in harm's way is deeply troubling. I've spent time in Ukraine. I have friends there. I spent time shortly after the last invasion of Russia in Crimea. So it's something that affects us all very deeply. And there are 1.3 million Canadians of Ukrainian descent in our country. So it does feel very personal. I think the international community's response so far has been moderate, and they have obviously been sending humanitarian relief, loans, and medical supplies. We are seeing lethal and non-lethal military equipment now making its way into the country. But that truly is what's needed most: is heavy armament. They need ammunition. They have no air cover to speak of, and that is all changing quite rapidly. And in addition, of course, we are seeing quite severe sanctions, which again have had a delayed impact, but are now starting to bite the Russian economy and Vladimir Putin quite closely. Many countries, including Canada, have put personal sanctions on him, the oligarchs and kleptocrats around him. These are intended, of course, to really hit Russia where it hurts, including cutting off gas supplies, their banking system. This is going to have long-term implications for not only Russia, the entire region, and really a reordering of the laws and principles around how the international community interacts.
Yes, and speaking of bridging the political differences, how international actors interact, you've worked on bridging political differences throughout your public service career, both within the conservative movement and beyond. A twofold question for you. First, for you as someone who grew up in Eastern Canada, how does it feel when a Western Canadian express their anger towards the East when they're actually referring to Ontario? And second, on a more serious note, what policies do you think the federal government should implement in order to reduce regional discontent in Canada?
Yeah, those are great questions. And it's a very insightful comment about sometimes that expression from Western Canada saying we're so mad at the East, and what they really mean is Central Canada, Quebec and Ontario. That has irritated me from time to time, and I've always pointed out the difference that there's a lot of country east of Montreal and Toronto, and that's not the East that they should be mad at. We've sent a lot of our very best, our young, bright, ambitious people out to Western Canada and to Central Canada, for that matter, to participate in nation building and working in the energy sector and working in hospitals and doing their studies. And so that type of sort of regional discrimination is something that I've tried to fight against and educate people about throughout my time in politics, and it continues to this day. The policies that I would love to see governments become more forward-leaning in involve those nation-building type projects and policies. A national energy program in the same spirit as our national railway, over 150 years ago, or at least 100 plus years ago, would go a long way to address some of the big problems, including being a provider of an alternative supply of gas to Europe at this critical time. Had we built the infrastructure and put in place the necessary port and shipping facilities, we could be doing that right now, which would do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than any policy that we could implement in Canada today. I think as well, some of the tensions that have existed in the past in Quebec and also in Western Canada, it would go a long way if we had in some form of a national exchange program where students and young people could travel and work and attend schools, and they can do that on their own. but I would like to see something more formalized that would allow young people the opportunity to experience different parts of the country. I was very fortunate in my youth and my university years. I worked tree planting in northern British Columbia. I went on an exchange in Chicoutimi in Quebec, and really wanted to travel extensively before I left the continent. I spent 2 summers working on supply ships in the high Arctic in our northern communities. And it was inspiring and incredibly uplifting to meet people from different parts of the country and really foster a greater understanding and a greater feeling of what it is to be a Canadian.
Absolutely. Human interactions is so important to understanding each other in such a diverse society. Mr. MacKay, back in 2003, you led the PC Party, the Progressive Conservative Party, to negotiate a historic merger with the Canadian Alliance and forming today's Conservative Party. I was wondering, from your experience, you had to face and reconcile a lot of political differences on both sides and trying to render that agreement. From your perspective, what should be the role of compromise in the political process today?
Well, it's an essential ingredient, Bincheng. I think we really need to try to get back to that place where we can have discussions, even contentious disagreements in the public square without resorting to name calling and recriminations and the type of really overt hostilities that we seem to embark on currently. And we've seen numerous examples of that. The period in time that you mentioned, 2002, 2003, in trying to reconcile the conservative movement in Canada, reconstruct a single national competitive alternative conservative party, it was a very difficult time. I still have the scars politically from having done that. And it's important to note that one other essential ingredient to that process was to have the equivalent of a national referendum where members of both the Alliance, then the Alliance, and the Progressive Conservative Party, the 2 original parties that came together to form the Conservative Party, they both voted overwhelmingly. Over 90% endorsed the concept and the reality of bringing the movement together in a way that would allow us to give Canadians an alternative, which to me is also extremely important in a democracy, is that Canadians can look to another party to form a government. That truly, to me, is again, the essence of democracy, is to have alternatives and to be competitive in the choice. And so I believe that the discussions around such big muscle movements as having political parties, but really what are in the country's best interest? What issues can we at least try to form a consensus on, whether it's how do we address climate change? What do we do to improve our national standing and our economy, our prosperity for all in all regions, our national defense, our fiscal policy? Those are all big questions that need to be addressed, and having a rigorous debate and forums for that debate, including our parliament, but including all forms of public debate, really are predicated on participation and predicated on respect and free speech and allowing people to have their say, and then moving sometimes towards a decision on what arguably are extremely difficult issues. But to do so without having it descend into a really nasty and name-calling misinformation campaign, that to me is something we need to do more to avoid.
And in connection with strengthening democracy, let's talk about young people and how to get young people more actively engaged in the political process. Elections Canada released a survey around 2 years ago indicating that young people today feel less strongly about participating in politics, and people might be more likely to join NGOs or even entirely disengaging from time to time. From your perspective, what caused the status quo, and what can we do to reverse this trend?
Yeah, Bincheng, I think it's been a long and steady decline in terms of youth engagement, unfortunately. And that's, there's a number of causes that led us to this point, the status quo. I think it has been a descent in large part caused, to some degree by what we were just discussing, and that is a feeling that politics isn't as impactful as it used to be. It doesn't matter who you vote for, that politics is a lot of talk and no action, a feeling that, you know, the majority, the outcome of an election then ignores the minority and doesn't allow for alternative voices and viewpoints to be heard or included in the debate. And so there are some structural things that could happen, including having a look at more online voting as an alternative if it is properly administered, having more open forums. And certainly one of the perhaps positives, and they're hard to find at times, of this pandemic is that we are having much more interaction online, as you and I are demonstrating, as we've seen numerous Zoom calls and Teams calls and Facebook Live. All of this has allowed for further engagement. Now, that comes with certain challenges as well, because again, the information isn't always accurate, and sometimes the anonymity, particularly on platforms like Twitter and others, it allows for a very caustic and very mean-spirited and sometimes inaccurate discussion. But it is a forum that is here to stay. And I think young people in many cases are far more adept, certainly than I and the generation before me. And so politics and democratic involvement, and not just political parties, but NGOs and media and all those forums really have to embrace the modern age of communication. And, you know, and I'm not advocating for strict legislation in this regard, but there has to be some guardrails in terms of keeping the debate on a civilized path and allowing for people to fairly express themselves and not be misrepresented. So I'm all for more public forums. I'm all for greater engagement on university campuses and community colleges, and even getting the political discussion in the high schools, and trying to get young people more engaged at an earlier age. I've had occasion to, throughout my career, speak to university classes and students and of all ages, and I always boil it down to some degree to a simple expression, and that is, you know, if you don't go to the dance, don't complain about the music. So, you know, go to the dance, be the music, play the music, be part of the decision making that inevitably will affect your life, and that message has to be carried. People are making decisions on your behalf. Don't you want to influence those decisions positively for yourself and your loved ones, or be the decision maker yourself? And, you know, we have seen some extraordinary young people take up that challenge and get involved in politics and change politics. And that, to me, again, is essential if we're going to continue to see the rise and the embrace of democracy in parts of the world where it doesn't exist, like China.
Thank you so much. That's such a powerful statement, and I think, you know, really speaks to the heart of this issue of youth engagement in public service. Thank you for that. And you mentioned, speaking of the pandemic, we've seen an increase in, unfortunately in this case, anti-Asian hate crimes happening in many countries during this pandemic, including Canada. Last year, Bloomberg News did a report saying that Vancouver in British Columbia saw around 700% increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. You've served as Attorney General and Minister of Justice of Canada. From your perspective, what can we do to reduce hate crimes and fight xenophobia on this front?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bincheng, and it's something that I've given a lot of thought to. I mean, much of this is brought about by some of those same dark forces online and elsewhere. And, you know, yes, the pandemic, I think, brought a certain unfair focus to people of Asian descent, and it's, you know, clearly a type of prejudice that has to be fought and combated at every turn, whether it's through our education system, through the media, but also our criminal justice system. And so, Bincheng, we have laws in Canada. Our criminal code is there to protect people from all forms of discrimination, assault, and the type of verbal abuse as well, and lies and propaganda that are spread online. And so those laws have to be enforced. And if that means increasing the emphasis or even the resources necessary to do so, I think that there are ways in which we can also tweak the legislation and the criminal code, calling out specific acts of hate crime. And we need, to give higher profile to those type of cases when they occur as a general and specific deterrence for those who would engage in that type of activity. But, to be fair, and we have a fairly robust criminal justice system and policing system in Canada now, part of the misconception, and my wife is Persian, for example, and she always reminds me of this when I'm speaking or in forums. She says, it's not the Iranian people that we have our difficulties with. It's not the Chinese citizens, or the Russian citizens. It's their regimes. It's their governments. It's their hostile, in some cases, totalitarian or dictatorships, or it's those individuals who are causing so much of the strife and the hate and the misinformation in the world. And so we need to hold them accountable. Things like the Magnitsky legislation that is in place in Canada, the United States, and other Western countries, that is intended to hold really international criminals, oligarchs, people who steal money, who engage in criminal activity and hide behind archaic laws in other parts of the world. We need to hold people to account. And, our justice system has as its very premise and its cornerstone accountability and taking responsibility for actions. So those are some of the things I think we need to do. Some of them are big and sound esoteric. Others, including perhaps changes to our criminal code, additional sentencing and sanctioning within that code. Those are things that can be done as well.
That is perfect. Thank you. And I want to thank you for your wife's work on this front. A few years ago, when there was a Ukrainian airline, a jetliner that was shot down over by Iran, I know your wife handled a lot of the fundraising efforts in Canada. We at the ECC, at our organization, also worked on that front, helping to fundraise for victims on that flight. So I want to thank her for her work. And
I'll pass that on to my wife, Nazanin. I know she'll be appreciative.
Thank you. And thank her for her work. And I think, speaking of your tenure as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, there was at the time, the issue of maintaining public trust in institutions. At the time, the Supreme Court of Canada, I believe, struck down a few pieces of criminal justice reform legislation that you were really advocating for. From your perspective, how should one maintain the public trust in these institutions when, in a sense, there's a conflict between the elected legislature and the courts?
I'd like to call it a healthy tension as opposed to a conflict. There are times when the judiciary are complementary. They sometimes, I guess for lack of a better term, fine-tune legislation. And of course, it wasn't just Conservative Party or our government's legislation that was struck down. Just within my tenure at the Department of Justice and Attorney General, we had legislation on medically assisted dying that was struck down by the courts. Legislation on the prostitution laws in Canada that had been in place and in the criminal code for over 100 years. But I know you're referring specifically to mandatory minimum penalties that we brought in that were meant to provide and promote deterrence for child sex offenders, or pedophiles, people who preyed on children, or those who used a weapon, a firearm, in the commission of a criminal offense. And what that was intended to do, and not to get too into the weeds on this, but it was intended to basically draw a clear red line between violent and non-violent offenses, and saying that for those type of acts, which are so heinous and so offensive and endanger vulnerable people, there should be a floor to the sentencing provisions that say it begins at jail. Sometimes a very low threshold of 6 months or 2 years less a day, but it begins with jail. If you touch a child for a sexual purpose, or you bring a gun to a break and enter, it should begin with jail, not house arrest, not a fine, but putting parameters around the criminal code. And look, to be clear, Bincheng, there has been mandatory minimum penalties in the criminal code for as long as we've had a criminal code. So this was not an insertion of some new concept by our government. Judicial activism has also been around as long as our justice system. And there have been periods in time where we saw more and sometimes less. It depends on the judge. It depends, of course, we saw a huge jump in judicial activism with the insertion of the charter into our constitution, which entrenched more the rights of Canadian citizens, including their rights vis-a-vis their government and within our justice system. So when I say attention, it's more the balance of the powers entrusted in our elected officials through our democratic process and by extension, the cabinet and the prime minister and ministers. And the judicial role is, of course, to oversee and to bring about the interpretation of law. And so from time to time, that that tension bubbles up, and we see judges taking positions that run contrary to the government of the day, or to even laws that have been on the books for a very long time. We had what I saw as an unprecedented intervention, and what I deem to be one of the most inappropriate acts of judicial activism in the denial of a Supreme Court nominee by the government, Mr. Justice Nadon. And I think, I'm trying to be objective, which I cannot, but that will probably go down as one of the worst decisions by our Supreme Court in the history of our system.
Understood. Our final question is about human rights, as you mentioned, and also businesses. Around 10 years ago, the UN outlined its mandatory human rights due diligence or recommendation, or proposals for the world governments to consider. And recently in the European Union, they were considering and debating this legislation for businesses to conduct human rights due diligence and to prevent human rights abusers from profiting out of their operations. From your perspective, is that something that Canada should do? Is that something that should be considered in Canada? And how can we make it effective in realizing the same?
Yeah, I think it is being considered, Bincheng, and I think that making it mandatory, while challenging, I think certainly making it more of an accepted practice, as we've seen with ESG and diversity, inclusivity, and equality. Those are aspects of the private sector hiring that have really been taken on board by corporations, although not mandated. There's become sort of an element of almost public shaming when businesses don't embrace this. But to calibrate it, I guess, is the question and the challenge, and to enforce it, of course. So I think you're seeing this practice being adopted to a large degree, perhaps not as quickly or as fulsome as we're seeing in the European Union and other jurisdictions, but it is here in North America, and it's taking root. And I think that is going to open up the type of opportunity, inclusivity that we want to see that the private sector will embark upon and will embrace. And so we're moving in the right direction. It's always incremental to some degree. But when businesses, of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum are being truly discriminatory and not following good business practices and not embracing that opportunity, there's recourse for that as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. MacKay, for your insights and for being on our program today. I'd like to close by wishing out our viewers good health during this time. Thank you and take care.
Thank you, Bincheng.